All right, so we got here just in time for the title slide, which is the Gibson's theory of perception and LIDA's dynamical perspective on cognition, is what I called it. And I got there some figures that show some texture gradients that specify three-dimensional space without vanishing points or the necessity of stereoscopic vision. So I thought those are pretty nice texture gradients. Okay, just briefly tell you what I'm going to talk about before I talk about it. I'm going to look at synchronization, which we've seen before, but I'm just going to introduce it and review it as a model of self-organization, the dynamics of self-organization in a dynamical system. And then something called Barham's tetratic model. I don't know if the name is familiar, but we've looked at it before, and it's about the dynamics of a biological system. Then I'm going to talk about Gibson's theory in the context of dynamical theory, which would be the dynamics of a perceptual system. Freeman's neurodynamics I am just going to touch upon. It is the gateway into the dynamics of a cognitive system, which we can talk about in LIDA. And I think that the rhythms hypothesis of the LIDA model is a key point for understanding how the entire agent environment system can be modeled as a dynamical system. So first, for synchronization, there's an old video that we've seen before, but let's look at some of it again. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out as we see them. We're going to look at about 50 seconds worth of the video. There's some initial phase relations between several metronomes. There's a coupling element. And then there'll be, as the system progresses, there'll be a state transition into an attractor. And we'll come back to this slide in a minute, but I just wanted to signal that we're going to be looking for those as we watch the video. Okay, so here we have, you see 5 metronomes, and they're all out of phase with each other. Now they quickly get into something that looks like they're going to synchronize, but then they're, again, wildly out of phase. The coupling is happening after he put this support plate on a couple of Coke cans, which allow it to roll. Now I'm told that metronomes will synchronize without that, but it'll just take an awful long time. And here they're getting close to being in phase. So we're undergoing a state transition. And I'd say we're probably close to being synchronized. But then it goes out a little bit. But then now it's coming back and it gets very stable. Okay. Now, a couple of things about self-organization. Let me make sure nothing else happens here. Just close that. That's the best way to do it. Notice that there was nothing in the system that was instructing the metronomes to synchronize. There was no pacemaker signal. Each was itself going at a frequency. They were set at the same frequency. So that was a constant. That's in a coupled oscillators. That's also something that could vary in a more complex system. But this is a simple system. The one variable is the phase of the different oscillators, and the attractor state, is the synchronization. But it's important to remember that in general, an attractor need not converge into a synchronized state. It just represents some kind of pattern that multiple states, starting states, will end up in, and those that set of such states is called the wing of an attractor. Wait a second. The wing is a portion of the, what's the whole thing called? I'm blanking.
Trajectory.
No, the trajectory is the path that the state takes into the attractor. Is the set of states that converge into that attractor, is that called the wing?
No.
No, it's the wing is a portion of that set.
Basin? Or?
The basin, thank you, the basin of attraction. And that's what I was looking for. So now there's another video that we'll look at real quickly, and it may not immediately be obvious why I'm showing you this. I think I'll play the sound just for the heck of it. It's got some music which may or may not be annoying, but what we have is a function generator here that's connected to a metal plate, and the videographer puts salt on the plate and then changes the frequency and watches different patterns emerge on the plate. And he goes on quite a ways. Watch for, I don't know, another 30 seconds or so. And that there are discrete frequencies at which the vibrational mode of the plate changes into a different discrete mode. I think that's enough.
How is the plate attached to whatever it's on?
I'm sorry?
How is the plate attached to whatever it's on?
He shows the setup at the beginning, and he takes 30 seconds to zoom in on it, and it's very dramatic, and I didn't think we added much. But there is the function generator on the left. Do you see to the left here?
Yeah.
And then, so it's, perhaps there's some sort of mechanical transducer underneath that's converting an electrical oscillation into a mechanical one, you know, a high frequency, low amplitude oscillation that then vibrates the entire plate at that frequency. And at certain frequencies, there will be a discrete mode of vibration that is revealed when you put the sand on the plate. So the sand reveals these vibrational modes, and I call them, you know, a la standing waves. There's a standing wave in a you know, a piece of rope that's got two nodes. I don't know if you remember the terms node and antinode, but the sand collects at the nodes of the vibration, where all the vibrations cancel out. There's relative, you know, stillness on the plate, and then the antinodes are certainly at the edges and corners where no sand ever settles because it's always vibrating, or the crest of the wave is at a maximum. So
as far back as the great days of Cremona violin making, Stradivarius and Guarneri Delieus, a technique, Chladni patterns, was used. Yep. Where particulate matter would be put on the surface of the violin in order to discover how to make the violin better.
Yes. Yes, what was it called? Chladni patterns?
Chladni or Chladni, I'm not quite sure the proper pronunciation.
Yes, I had seen that before. I had forgotten it, but that definitely, you know, it's not something that this guy Bruspup discovered. It's just, I think that his presentation is very, very accessible and very compelling. It was a lot harder for them to do in those days, and I can't remember the technique. I saw some drawings from online at some point from like a 17th century book or something where they had, and there may be, I don't know if it was Newton, there may be a contemporary of Newton who did some, you know, more kind of natural philosophy around the phenomenon. That might be who did the book that I saw, but yeah. So this is something that we take for granted, but such vibrational modes are, you know, in all the surfaces that we see around us, and are responsible for some of the pitches that we hear when we tap on things. Now, the modes of coupling govern, I'm claiming, that similar modes of coupling in the support system govern the interactions between the metronomes. So it's unrevealed by sand or any other method, although perhaps you might study the rocking on the Coke cans. The Coke can certainly changes the dynamics of the mechanical coupling between the metronomes. I've heard an anecdote that in an old house with many grandfather clocks, the grandfather clocks will eventually synchronize through the framework of the house, through the vibrational modes of the house itself. But it takes a long time, days, weeks, months, I don't know, for that attractor to evolve into a synchronized state. But so I'm claiming that there's something similar going on with the base of the metronomes as we observe in the Chladni plate-like images. And I'm sorry, not my slide. I tried to put a URL in there for posterity's sake, and I forgot that I had multiple slides. Anyway, so the synchronized, we look at the metronomes and we say that, you know, they synchronize, and it seems mysterious, but I think including the coupling surface in the dynamical system and understanding that there is an attractor or a preferred mode in the actual oscillations as they travel in the surface on which the metronomes rest, that's part of the attractor. So in other words, the dynamical system completely described would include state variables that describe the wave, the physical wave that's in the coupling surface, as well as the phase of the metronomes, and that there's an attractor or a preferred and stable, quasi-stable state in the plate that evolves at the same time that the synchronized state does. So that's a claim that kind of underlies some of the things that I'm going to say moving forward.
Say it again.
Okay, so we look at the phase of the metronomes relative to one another and see how they have a trajectory of being kind of out of phase and being in a relatively disorganized state, and then they proceed into an attractor in which they're phase synchronized. I'm claiming that the surface on which they rest is part of the dynamical system, and that the attractor of the metronomes includes a dynamical state of the within the plate that is itself an attractor on the dynamics of the plate, and so the entire system is an attractor.
Entire system, including the metronomes and the plates and the...
Well, yes, in the case of where the coupling surface has the wheels, yes. So, but whatever the coupling medium is, it has a dynamics, and in order for a synchronized state to occur within the metronome, there has to be some kind of attractor that's ordered enough to transmit the interactions between the metronomes so as to maintain that synchronization.
Yes.
So we don't see the dynamics of the surface unless we do something to reveal it, like putting the sand on it in the Rust Pup video. But it's there, and it has to be included in a complete model, a dynamical model of the system. Now, okay, so that's just kind of an introduction looking at the self-organizing dynamics in a mechanical system to remind us of the basic principles. I now want to go to a biological system and begin looking in greater detail at Barham's tetradic model, which we have looked at before. And I think when you see the figure, you're going to you may remember the figure, but I'm going to add a lot to what we've said in the past and really break down the components of the figure and how they relate to one another, what's really being said, and many of the principles that we just reviewed for the mechanical system are going to, in some form, be present in this model as well. And I don't think that's apparent necessarily just from a cursory inspection of the figure. But if you look at the principles that it represents, it's clearly the case. So let's begin with Barham's, a quote from Barham's paper. Living systems achieve limited autonomy from local high energy potentials by becoming sensitive to non-local low energy fluxes. What does this mean? Well, autonomy from an energy potential is, okay, let's say I'm an organism and I rely on glucose for energy. Autonomy means I can survive if I'm not immediately in the presence of glucose. Right? That's a kind of autonomy, and it's limited because I can't survive indefinitely. But I have some kind of reserve within my cellular compartment, of energy that allows me to live and behave even when I'm not in contact with a local source of glucose. And a living system would have an organism that relies on glucose and is mobile. Many such organisms have some way of sensing a glucose gradient. It's called chemotaxis. It's a kind of a sensory molecule that will, and it's coupled to a motility mechanism, and it allows the organism to migrate in the direction of increasing glucose gradient. So the small gradient of glucose in the, I'm assuming an aqueous environment for this bacterium, is non-local because it is distributed throughout the medium. It's not confined to the location of the glucose, source.
The gradient is not.
Correct. And it's distributed. It's non-local, and it's low energy in relation to the glucose. It's not of sufficient energy to feed the organism. So this is an example of what he means by that, but there are many other examples of high energy potentials and low energy fluxes in the application of this general idea to biological systems. Okay, so it's a general principle which Barham kind of puts together to kind of define the dynamics of living systems in general. Sean?
So in this example with limited autonomy, it sounds like what you're saying is that you have a certain amount of resilience to not having a local high energy potential by being able to find local high energy potentials using non-local low energy fluxes. Is that what limited autonomy means, is being able to withstand a certain amount of time in the absence of...
Good question. Limited autonomy is very much related to what's called weak coupling. A strong coupling is an immediate effect, like if the mechanical oscillators were linked by rigid bars. That's very strong coupling, and it's immediate. There's no autonomy.
Makes sense.
In the case that we saw, there's limited autonomy, but there is a coupling. And so and I think back to what you said sounded correct to me. The idea is that the strong coupling would mean that if the glucose level is high, then the organism is fine, and if it goes below a certain level, the organism immediately dies. Such an organism would not have autonomy from the energy source, But if it has some kind of time lag whereby it can survive and
somehow get back on a trajectory that takes you back to the high potential or high energy.
Or it has the possibility of making some sort of coping behavior
Right.
that prevents it from dying as a result of the environmental fluctuation.
Okay.
So, you know, temperature fluctuations are also an important example, and the cold-blooded and warm-blooded poikilotherm versus homeothermy, you know, in the animal kingdom, you know, are examples of the ways that organisms couple or decouple with a very important environmental parameter of the temperature.
Right. It seems like in that case, there's actually something interesting there, because for a cold-blooded animal, you're still using non-local low-energy fluxes in order to find a way to get your body regulated to, you know,
Yes.
to get you into the sun. But if you're warm-blooded, you actually have a local source of,
You have
I don't know
greater
what you call it.
autonomy. You have greater autonomy if you're warm-blooded, I think.
right?
You know, but yes, yeah, you do have still have some limited autonomy if you're a poikilotherm.
Right.
But yes, you know, very much so.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah. So, good on that? Thanks for those questions, those are good. All right, so I think we've said much of this already. In words, a biological system in Barham's conception is an oscillator. It's a dynamical system which has a time-varying state, and it seeks to preserve its own dynamical stability. Equifinality is a fancy word for attractor dynamics. It means equal end in Latin, the same end, the same destiny. So a basin of attraction is a set of initial states that all have the same final state in their trajectory. And that's equifinality. It's a problem for determinism, but it's very characteristic of biological systems. And energy autonomy is pretty much, I think, what we've already discussed. If there is an example, it is you know, in a famine, you know, if there's a relative famine of an energy source that can, the organism can in some way sense that and choose to conserve its energy, you know, so as to not be depleted. Or it can choose to expend its energy in pursuit of replenishment. And so it has these choices. And in fact, this sets up a scenario in which the organism might have to choose what to do next. So,
I'm sorry, Steve, just one quick question. I've been trying to figure out what you meant by it. So you said equifinality is a problem for determinism. What did you mean by that?
well, in determinism, if you in a deterministic model, if you define a state and you know the laws of nature,
Right.
then you can determine its previous state and its future state.
Sure.
And when you have equifinality, you have a problem going back and saying, oh, if
Oh,
it's at
because
this
you're
point at
basically-
12 o'clock, where was it at 6 in the morning?
Right. Okay.
You
I
know,
see.
because if it could have started in many different places, you no longer have a one-to-one mapping.
Okay. You've lost the history. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the basic idea.
So equifinality simply means that it goes to some attractor.
Yes. It's a word that's used in the context of attractor dynamics. Okay, now this is the figure that we've seen in the past, the tetratic model of perception and action. And again, that's what Barham calls it. And he defines, I think, perception and action in the context of an organism, and he sort of defines them so that intrinsically that they're synonymous with a biological system. I mean, it's very interesting. So I think there'll be, as we read through some of his descriptions of this model and what he's claiming, the words that he uses will sometimes be cognitive, and they may in many cases mean the same thing or something similar as when we use that word, like sensation, for instance, but there will also be differences. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So we have 4 elements in this model within a system, a meta system, a larger system that it includes a smaller system and its surround. The environment and the organism is what he's getting at here. I'm going to go through this model element by element and build it up. So if you can, best you can, keep this in your head. I'm going to take it away and put it back piece by piece. The first part of it is in the lower right, the functional action. And this is what he calls a high energy interaction of the oscillator, the organism, with a set of constraints in its surrounds. And so this is the high energy environmental constraints. It could be anything that has functional significance to the organism, biological significance to the organism. It could be the presence or absence of a predator. It could be a physical object that the organism may have a favorable or an unfavorable result from having contact with it. You know, like a tree could be the oscillator, and the location of the tree relative to the organism is going to change over time. And if the organism runs into the tree, it could be injured. But maybe, depending on the organism, the tree might be a food source or a place to hide. Anything that has biological significance for the organism can be modeled by this abstract thing, which is called a high energy environmental constraint. And it's part of the dynamical system of the environment.
So in particular, you could have the organism at the bottom and a food source at the top.
Yes, the system in the box is the organism. And the functional action, we're going to see a loop, but the functional action is what is the right thing, the next right thing for the organism to do when it's in contact with that, in regards to that. Oscillator, that high energy oscillator in the environment, B. That's backwards. Okay, let's go forwards. All right, so we're adding C, which is a low energy constraint that's highly correlated with B. And this is information because of the already assumed functional relationship or functional significance between the organism and this environmental phenomenon.
This is the low energy flux you talked about before.
That's right. And it enables the organism to have advanced knowledge of the high energy situation. Now, the last piece is this epistemon, and I'm going to go to another slide to get that on because there's a lot to say about it. This is a generalized sense organ. And when he says sense organ, please don't assume that he means sensory memory or anything like that. Put quotes, or he doesn't, but I recommend the use of quotes around the word sense here, because we've got to be very open about what that's going to mean, I think, before we connect it to our own ideas. But so C, the low energy flux in the environment, has a direct interaction with this small oscillator within the system. And that interaction causes a state transition in D. And that state transition triggers the functional action. And this is the tetradic, what he calls the tetradic model of perception and action. All right? So, yeah.
So the D over here is an epistemon, which by the word, it seems to me that it's like a piece of knowledge, right? So is it right to say that a piece of knowledge undergoes a straight state transition?
No, I wouldn't say, I say, when you say it the first time, a piece of knowledge, and you put quotes around it, it's okay, I think, to say it that way. But then when you go to the next statement, you're getting too literal with that.
Piece of knowledge.
He uses the word, and I don't think it's so much a piece of knowledge as, he's going to use the word projection in a moment. And I think I go to that quote next. So let's look at the quote first, and then come back to that question. I think it may clear up, and if it doesn't, we can say it again. So this is the overall figure, and here's a quote which is longish, but I'll read through. I've actually cut it down quite a bit and put it into the figure, and I think it'll be worthwhile. But the first sentence is going to summarize what we've just said, but afterwards I think it gets into an interesting kind of perspective. As a result of the interaction between the low energy constraints and the epistemon, the latter undergoes a state transition which acts as a trigger for the functional action A, thus completing one.
That's action selection.
Well, it may, yeah, that's, I think so. I think that works. Again, let's be cautious about making those maps, but I agree. I like to make those mappings myself, from his model to ours, and then I think it probably, we can get it to work. Now, provided only that the two sets of exogenous constraints, the high energy B and low energy C, stand in some causal relation to each other, the precise nature of which will vary from case to case, then the correlation D to A between the epistemon state transition and the oscillation of the biofunction, that's the functional action, becomes in effect an internal projection of the correlation BC between the high and low energy constraints. So, and then the quote goes on, that is, the low energy constraints act as semantic information with respect to the functional action, indicating the presence of those external conditions which successfully support its action. You know, that's a good one to read twice.
Wait a minute. Go back, I've lost track of which are the low energy constraints and which are the high energy constraints.
Okay, C is the low energy and B is the high energy.
Okay,
So that's,
why does he call them constraints? Constraints on what?
well, constraints on possible states of the system.
Some possible states of the system. Okay,
Okay.
that makes sense.
So the low energy constraints act as semantic information with respect to the functional action, indicating the presence of those external conditions which successfully support its action. Now, there's a hint as to where I'm going